No one expected the scene that unfolded on the quiet tree-lined suburban street that Thursday afternoon, least of all Officer Darren Johnson, a man with 12 years of service, a reputation for being by the book, and a low tolerance for nonsense, especially from elderly folks who, in his opinion, tended to stretch the rules with entitlement. He had responded to a noise complaint that came in from a neighbor about loud shouting and suspicious activity at the small but well-kept home of 75-year-old Agnes Whitmore, a widow known in the neighborhood for her flower garden, cookies, and firm opinions about property lines. Before we begin today's story, please let us know where you are viewing from. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. As Johnson pulled up, he assumed this was just another routine check. Probably Agnes yelling at a raccoon again, or berating kids for walking across her lawn. But when he knocked and Agnes answered the door with a smile that was a little too calm, he instantly felt something was off. There was a flicker in her eyes that told him she wasn't intimidated, and before he could ask a single question, Agnes subtly adjusted the position of a ceramic vase on a side table. An innocuous act to anyone else, but to the trained eye of someone like her son Jack, it was a coded message. The tension escalated quickly when Johnson tried to step inside without a warrant, thinking he could push his authority like he'd done in past neighborhood encounters. Agnes, however, had been preparing for this moment for months. You see, what no one knew, especially not Officer Johnson, was that Agnes wasn't just some helpless retiree. She was the mother of Jack Whitmore, a career Delta Force operative who had returned from overseas missions a year ago and taken up a quiet role training security forces and consulting for the military, all while secretly living in the basement apartment of Agnes' house to keep an eye on her, and, more importantly, to train her. After a previous incident with Officer Johnson months earlier where he had manhandled Agnes during a dispute about a supposed code violation, something trivial that had gotten unnecessarily aggressive, Jack had come home to find his mother shaken but furious. That day changed everything. Jack realized that no amount of tactical skill or honor earned on the battlefield mattered if he couldn't protect the person he loved most. So he began training Agnes, not just in self-defense, but in situational awareness, verbal judo, hand-to-hand restraint techniques, and even how to send signals in case he wasn't nearby. Agnes, despite her arthritis and insistence on knitting during breaks, turned out to be a remarkable student. She wasn't strong, but she was precise, calm under pressure, and had a memory like a steel trap. So on that day when Officer Johnson returned, he didn't just find an old woman in a cardigan. He found a calm, prepared, and subtly dangerous opponent who had been quietly waiting for him to cross the line again. As the officer raised his voice and threatened to call in backup, Agnes positioned herself by the hallway, where she had installed a subtle mirror that let her see behind without turning. She gave a slight nod, barely perceptible, and that was all Jack needed. From his concealed position just inside the basement stairwell, Jack silently emerged, his presence invisible until it was too late. He didn't strike, he never needed to. Instead, he used verbal redirection, de-escalation tactics, and a calm, commanding tone that immediately shifted the dynamic. "Officer, you're trespassing, and you're escalating a situation that doesn't exist. I advise you to step outside and calm down before this gets worse, for you." Johnson, caught off guard by Jack's sudden presence and composed demeanor, instinctively reached for his radio, but Jack had already anticipated that. In one smooth motion, he moved forward, gently but firmly redirecting the officer's arm downward, using a maneuver that applied no pressure but controlled movement completely. Agnes watched silently, proud and unshaken. "I'd advise you not to escalate this further," Jack repeated, his voice firm, his training kicking in, his presence like steel wrapped in velvet. Johnson, humiliated and cornered, finally backed down and left the property, but not before snarling a warning that he'd be back with a warrant. Jack knew that was bluster. There was no legal basis. But the moment wasn't about the law, it was about the message. Later that evening, as Agnes calmly poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, Jack smiled. "You handled that well, Mom," he said. Agnes smirked and replied, "You think I was going to let him treat me like that again?" He didn't know he was walking into Delta Force boot camp. Their laughter echoed through the house as the surveillance footage Jack had installed captured the entire encounter. It wasn't about violence. It was about preparation, poise, and knowing that even a 75-year-old grandmother could be a formidable force when armed with knowledge, support, and just a bit of Delta Force wisdom. The story didn't end there, though. Word began to spread through the neighborhood. Agnes, once just the cookie lady, became the quiet legend of their street. Whispers passed between neighbors about how she'd taken down a cop. Well, maybe not taken down, but outmaneuvered him, with the skill and calm of a seasoned pro. Jack, always in the background, kept training her, just in case. Because the world didn't stop being dangerous just because you got older. In fact, that was when you needed to be the strongest, and Agnes was ready. She continued her walks every morning, gardened in the afternoon, and once a week practiced scenarios with Jack, complete with role-play drills and home defense simulations. She even started writing down tactical tips in a little notebook, which she jokingly titled, The Granny Guide to Tactical Living. Officer Johnson, meanwhile, filed a report that went nowhere and found himself reassigned after an internal review turned up several complaints from other residents about his aggressive behavior. Jack and Agnes never heard from him again, but they remained vigilant. Because the truth was simple. When you mix family loyalty with elite training and an indomitable will, even the most unlikely hero can change the story. Life after the incident, that hero just happened in its empowering rhythm for Agnes banana bread in town, as if a new chapter of their lives had opened. One not governed by fear or frailty, but by control, preparedness, and the bond between mother and son that now glowed with purpose. The aftermath of Officer Johnson's retreat left a ripple across the community. Neighbors whispered about the tough old lady and her mysterious son, but they also began to look at Agnes differently. Gone were the assumptions of fragility. In their place was a quiet respect. For Agnes, it was more than vindication, it was a rebirth. She started to carry herself with even more confidence, sharpening her senses, observing everything around her with the heightened awareness Jack had taught her. She became more attuned to the subtle movements of people, the tone of their voices, even the direction of the wind before a storm. Meanwhile, Jack, ever the strategist, expanded her training with carefully plotted scenarios, designed to blend seamlessly into her daily routines. He turned grocery trips into situational drills, gardening into strength and flexibility sessions, and their weekly bingo games at the community center into lessons on people watching and behavioral cues. Agnes took to all of it with the curiosity and determination of a soldier in training, her sharp wit and memory helping her absorb concepts that many half her age would struggle with. But life, as Jack knew too well, was never content with quiet peace for long. About 6 weeks after the incident, a new threat emerged, one far more complicated than an overzealous cop. Agnes began to notice a black SUV that seemed to appear on her street more often than coincidence allowed. At first, she chalked it up to paranoia, but when it showed up for the third time in a week, parked just far enough away to be inconspicuous, she mentioned it to Jack. He sprang into action, activating the small drone surveillance system he'd rigged using parts from a former military recon kit. With his background, it took less than a day to confirm his suspicions. The SUV belonged to a private security contractor with ties to a defense firm Jack had once exposed for corruption overseas. That revelation changed everything. Jack realized that the quiet life he and his mother had built was under threat, not just from local law enforcement, but from powerful enemies who still bore grudges. He hadn't told Agnes the full extent of his last mission. How he had led a team to dismantle an illegal weapons trafficking ring operating under the guise of military contracts, and how that mission had ended in a high-profile arrest that embarrassed some very rich and very dangerous people. Now it seemed one of them had found him, and was using surveillance to track his movements through the only vulnerable part of his life, his mother. Jack doubled down. He fortified the house, upgraded the security system, installed silent alarms, and gave Agnes a new set of protocols to follow in case of emergency. Agnes, instead of being frightened, felt invigorated. Let them come. she said one evening as they reviewed escape plans over dinner. "They'll find out what a real old-school welcome looks like." And she wasn't joking. With Jack's help, she learned how to disarm an intruder, how to set up diversion traps, how to communicate in code through household objects. Jack even taught her a few escape and evasion techniques designed for operatives behind enemy lines. She was no longer just prepared, she was dangerous in her own right. Then came the night it all escalated. Around 2:13 a.m., the silent alarm triggered. Jack was out on a supply run, a rare lapse, but he had taught Agnes well. She awoke instantly, rolled out of bed, and followed the pre-programmed route through the house that allowed her to observe without being seen. Two figures were outside, one near the side window, the other at the back door. Agnes didn't panic. She didn't scream. She calmly retrieved the toolbox Jack had built for her, disguised as a sewing kit, which contained a non-lethal stun pen, flash distraction beads, a smoke canister, and a GPS beacon. She activated the emergency ping, which sent a direct signal to Jack's burner phone, then began implementing the distraction protocol. In the kitchen, she triggered the motion-activated sprinkler system outside to disorient the man at the window. Then she tossed one of the flash beads onto the porch, where it exploded with a blinding flash that startled the intruder at the back. She moved silently, just as Jack had taught her, using the blind spots in their approach and ducking behind the built-in pantry wall as one of the men entered through the back, gun drawn. He was military trained, but not as trained as Jack, and certainly not expecting a 75-year-old to know how to exploit the acoustics of her house. She knocked a hanging ladle from the far end of the kitchen to create a sound diversion, then used the smoke canister to create confusion. By the time the man reached the noise, Agnes was behind him, and with a stunning precision, she used the stun pen on the exposed part of his neck. He crumpled instantly, muscles seized. The second intruder, trying to navigate the smoke outside, didn't fare much better. Jack had returned, responding to the ping, and with his own brand of silent force, incapacitated the man before he could flee. When the police arrived, called in by neighbors awakened by the chaos, they found Agnes calmly sipping tea on her front porch, wrapped in a shawl, and Jack standing beside her with both intruders zip-tied and unconscious on the grass. The official report cited attempted burglary, but Jack knew better. The vehicle's plates were fake, the weapons traced to a company now dissolved, and the men's fingerprints matched with a rogue private contractor unit that had been blacklisted. This was personal. But Agnes wasn't rattled. If anything, she was emboldened. The incident made local headlines, spun into a bizarre yet inspiring story of a senior citizen defending herself against armed criminals. The media dubbed her Granny Delta, a nickname she found hilarious. Jack worried the attention might draw more heat, but Agnes reminded him, "It's not about hiding anymore, it's about standing your ground." After that night, people started coming to Agnes not just for her cookies, but for advice. Younger women in the neighborhood wanted to learn self-defense. Retired veterans dropped by to share tactical tips. Even local police began to change their tune, offering neighborhood watch support instead of suspicion. Jack and Agnes realized they'd created something bigger than themselves, an example. So they started informal training sessions in the community center, focused on awareness, de-escalation, and safety. Agnes took the lead, often beginning sessions with humorous stories that masked deep tactical wisdom. "When someone's yelling, don't match their pitch," she'd say. "Drop yours, slow your speech, and control the rhythm. It's not about being louder, it's about being more grounded." Jack watched with pride. His mother had transformed, not into someone new, but into someone she'd always been beneath the layers of age and societal assumptions. A leader, a protector, a fighter. And in doing so, she'd brought out a new side of him too. The teacher, the mentor, the son who'd found peace not through war but through home. But as they both knew, peace had to be protected. Jack began working discreetly to find out who sent the men that night, using his old contacts in intelligence circles and running a quiet digital trace. What he found was troubling. A name from the past, someone he thought long gone. Dominic Creel, a former private military commander turned rogue operator, whose financial backers had been ruined when Jack's team took down their weapons ring. Creel had lost everything, and now it seemed he wanted revenge. Jack knew this wouldn't be over until Creel was stopped for good. And so, while the world saw a quirky, uplifting story of a granny who could fight, Jack began quietly preparing for a final confrontation. And Agnes? She polished her kettle and re-threaded her sewing kit, whispering to herself with a smile, "Let them try again. I'm ready." As Jack delved deeper into the shadowy web behind Dominic Creel's resurgence, Agnes continued her transformation from the neighborhood's sweet old lady to its iron-hearted guardian, a symbol of resilience, resourcefulness, and wisdom honed over a lifetime, and now sharpened by elite training. She still baked cookies and tended to her roses, but neighbors watched with awe as she also led morning drills at the community center, teaching situational awareness with the same ease she taught canning recipes. But Jack knew they were operating against the clock. He had traced encrypted communications through black market nodes in Belarus and Turkey, then followed the money trail through dummy corporations that all pointed back to Creel's shadow empire. Agnes, aware of Jack's growing concern, didn't need details. She could feel it in her bones. "He's coming, isn't he?" she asked one night as they sat in the quiet glow of the kitchen, sipping mint tea. Jack nodded grimly. "Yeah. And he won't send amateurs this time." Jack wasn't wrong. Within days, a former contact from Delta Force sent an encrypted message. Creel had formed a splinter unit made up of dishonorably discharged operatives and outcast mercenaries. Their last known movement? A plane that had landed 2 states away under a fake humanitarian banner. Agnes didn't flinch. Instead, she asked Jack to walk her through worst-case scenarios. They planned defenses not only for the house, but for every location Agnes frequented. The library, grocery store, community garden. Jack installed surveillance nodes in public areas, hid RFID-triggered alert systems in her purse and coat, and rehearsed contingency plans under timed conditions. But the enemy had evolved too. Creel's men didn't strike like the first 2 intruders. Instead, they started a campaign of intimidation. The first sign came when Agnes found her rose garden shredded one morning, every bloom cut clean at the stem, no footprints, no noise. The second came a week later, when Jack's encrypted server was breached momentarily, only long enough for someone to upload a single image, a photograph of Jack's Delta Force unit with one member's face burned out. The message was clear. Jack responded by reaching out to his most trusted team member, Mia Reyes, a cyber intelligence specialist with a reputation for making hackers cry. She flew in under the radar, posing as a cousin visiting from Texas, and immediately set up a counter-infiltration protocol. With her help, they discovered Creel's splinter cell had embedded someone locally. The question wasn't if the attack was coming, but when, and who was already watching them. Meanwhile, Agnes remained calm. She doubled her training, invited local women into her home, and began hosting informal workshops called Tea and Tactics, where she'd show attendees how to use everyday items, umbrella tips, knitting needles, even handbags, as defensive tools. The local paper ran a front-page feature titled, "The Warrior Widow of Maple Street," and while the tone was light-hearted, it caught the attention of people who mattered. Veterans groups began sending her letters of admiration, some even asking to train with her. But Creel didn't care about admiration, he cared about payback. And so came the third act of his plan. On a rainy Thursday morning, while Agnes was walking to her community garden, a delivery van with no markings rolled down the street, moving too slowly to be casual. Jack was across town dealing with a city permit issue, and Reyes was running diagnostics from the basement. Agnes noticed the van's tires were military-grade, its windows tinted too dark, its license plates partially taped. She quickened her pace but didn't run. The van stopped 30 feet ahead, the back doors swung open, and 2 men in raincoats stepped out. Fast, coordinated, and silent. But Agnes didn't panic. Instead, she pivoted to the side alley behind the church and triggered one of the hidden alert nodes Jack had set up. Then, Ducking low behind a stone bench, she reached into her cane, a modified tactical tool Jack had gifted her, and pulled the concealed pepper burst mechanism. As the men closed in, she released it, sending a cloud of military-grade capsaicin into the alley's narrow airspace. Both men reeled back, coughing and blinded. Agnes moved swiftly, circling around and using a back door through the church she had memorized years ago. By the time Jack's alert buzzed and he arrived, the van was gone. But so was Agnes, hidden safely inside the nave with a locked door and a loaded emergency GPS in hand. This confirmed it. Creel wasn't testing the waters anymore. Jack immediately expanded their perimeter defense, moved Agnes into a secondary safe house for the weekend, and began staging a counter-operation. He and Reyes used surveillance footage and traffic drones to track the van's path, cross-referencing with local gas station records and backdoor satellite access. They found their staging point, a vacant warehouse in the industrial zone near the docks. But Jack didn't plan a raid alone. He contacted two more former teammates, Ricky Gunner Malone and Theo Watchdog Parks. Both owed Jack their lives and were eager to repay the favor. The plan was simple: extract, neutralize, and interrogate. But Creel was one step ahead. When they breached the warehouse, it was empty, save for a message painted on the wall in red: "She dies next time." It was a game of psychological warfare, and Jack was furious. Agnes, however, remained unshaken. That night, as the team debriefed over maps and data, she stood quietly and said, "You boys are playing offense. Maybe it's time I went on defense, my kind of defense." The room went silent. Then, slowly, smiles crept across their faces. What followed was a 3-day blitz of planning, preparing, baiting, and executing. Agnes, wearing a hidden tracker and layered with protection, was the decoy. They orchestrated a fake routine community event, then a solo walk home, but in reality, they had 5 backup teams stationed along the route, aerial drone support, and Agnes herself carrying a modified cane with enough counter-surveillance tech to fool a satellite. Creel's men took the bait. 3 black-clad operatives emerged from a nondescript sedan and surrounded Agnes near the old Fountain Park. But as they moved in, Reyes jammed their communications, Malone and Parks flanked from the west, and Jack descended from a rooftop zipline, disarming the leader mid-step with a precision strike. The fight lasted 90 seconds. All 3 men were subdued, tied, and extracted. Jack didn't let his emotions show until they were back in the safe house, but when he did, it came out in one long breath. "You scared me, Mom." Agnes smiled and replied, "You scared me for 40 years, Jack. I think we're even now." The real victory came during the interrogation. One of Creel's men flipped, revealing the location of Creel's mobile command hub, a converted cargo ship docked under fake credentials 3 states away. It was too big for just Jack and his team, so he made a quiet call to an old handler in military intelligence. Within hours, the operation was greenlit. Jack was offered temporary reinstatement for the mission, and his only condition? "My team comes with me. That includes my mother." They laughed, until they realized he was serious. But Jack didn't mean Agnes would fight. She'd be the heart of the operation, the one to whom the team owed their resurgence, their clarity, their bond. On mission day, as they stormed the cargo ship with stealth and precision, Agnes waited in the control van, monitoring feeds, offering guidance, and reminding Jack of his own humanity. The takedown was surgical. Creel was captured, the rogue network dismantled, and Jack's team was offered commendations, though all of them declined, preferring the anonymity that came with the shadows. Jack returned home a hero only to his mother, which was all he ever wanted. And Agnes? She was content to fade back into her role as the wise matriarch of Maple Street, though now she had a new project, turning her basement into a community safety training hub. Local kids started calling her Commander Nana, and the name stuck. Life, as it tends to do, returned to normal, but nothing was quite the same. Jack decided to stay for good, converting the garage into his operations center and offering private security consultations. Agnes began writing a book, Part memoir, part tactical manual, part love letter to the idea that no one is ever too old to fight for what matters. And every Friday, without fail, Jack and Agnes would sit on the porch, tea in hand, watching the sun dip behind the hills, not as a soldier and his aging mother, but as partners, survivors, and symbols of what strength looks like when it's born from love, tested by fire, and passed down through generations. The threats would always come, but now the world knew. Even the fiercest enemies should think twice before messing with a woman trained by Delta Force, and loved by one. Months passed, but echoes of the operation continued to ripple beneath the surface of their quiet suburban life. Though Creel was in custody and the rogue unit dismantled, Jack remained vigilant, sensing that somewhere in the darkness, others were watching. Silent adversaries who had seen how a Delta Force operative and his mother had disrupted a clandestine network. Agnes, too, felt the tension that pulsed quietly beneath their normal routine, but she channeled it into something powerful. She expanded her basement workshops, turning them into a self-defense program officially endorsed by local law enforcement. It started as a community initiative, but quickly gained traction beyond the neighborhood. People traveled from towns away to learn Commander Nana's 5 Laws of Survival, which blended practical safety skills with stories of courage, mental discipline, and maternal wisdom. Meanwhile, Jack took on consulting contracts for government security firms and began training veterans transitioning to civilian life. Every client, every mission, every handshake came with the silent acknowledgement that his mother had been the one to rekindle his sense of purpose. Agnes grew into a local legend. Reporters begged for interviews, but she declined most of them, preferring to let the stories live through those she helped. Still, word spread, and one day, an invitation arrived from the Pentagon, not for Jack but for Agnes. They wanted to recognize her contribution to national security in a private ceremony. She nearly laughed it off until Jack sat beside her and said, "You earned this. And more." At the ceremony, she stood in front of 4-star generals, cabinet officials, and a small crowd of analysts and military brass. She didn't speak for long, just a few words about motherhood, courage, and staying dangerous in a world that too often underestimated the quiet ones. That speech was later quoted in a military leadership seminar. Yet peace didn't last long. One evening, a former contact of Jack's, a deep-cover operative known only as Monarch, reached out with an encrypted distress signal. Her last known location was Montenegro, embedded in an operation tied to international arms dealing, some of which traced back to the same shell corporations used by Creel's network. The files she'd attempted to transmit were intercepted mid-transfer. Jack, troubled by the overlap, suspected that Creel's arrest had only scratched the surface. There was a bigger machine at work, a consortium of ex-operatives, war profiteers, and black market engineers who weren't loyal to any flag. Agnes didn't hesitate. "She's one of yours. We go," she said, packing her travel bag with the same steadiness she used to fold laundry. Jack tried to object, but Agnes shut him down with a look. "If this is deeper than Creel, then the people behind it already know who we are. We can either wait to be hunted or make the first move." And so began their next operation. With help from Reyes, they staged a cover story. Agnes was on a European heritage tour, and Jack was a private security contractor escorting her through high-risk territories. The plane to Montenegro was uneventful, but once on the ground, things shifted quickly. Surveillance showed they were being followed within 24 hours of arrival. Jack used burner phones, double-blind routes, and urban evasion tactics, while Agnes, cloaked in a floral shawl and using a new titanium cane with RFID jamming capabilities, watched, listened, and remembered every face they passed. Monarch's last ping led them to a cafe near the Bay of Kotter, where they found a dead drop hidden inside a loose brick. The flash drive inside held fragments of encrypted financial transactions, warehouse coordinates in Croatia, and surveillance photos of a meeting between someone identified as Echo and an unknown American financier. That name, Echo, made Jack's blood freeze. Echo was an ex-Delta Force ghost who'd vanished years ago after being implicated in war crimes and rogue ops. If he was involved, this was more than a criminal syndicate. It was a cabal built from the bones of disavowed soldiers. Agnes studied the documents and noticed something others might have missed. Timestamps matched satellite transit cycles. That detail helped Reyes narrow Echo's movements to a shipping corridor used for smuggling rare earth materials. Monarch's trail went cold for 3 days, until a local contact, a reformed smuggler named Luca, handed Jack a burner phone that had been tossed into his storage locker anonymously. It rang only once, and when Jack answered, a distorted voice said, "She's alive. But time is short. You'll need the ledger." Then silence. No caller ID. No trace. Agnes watched Jack's face tighten and said, "Then let's go get that ledger." They traced it to a bank in Rijeka, Croatia, stored under a pseudonym known only in CIA blacklists. Reyes joined them on site, using a backdoor code to override security systems. Inside the vault they found the ledger. A thick, worn book filled with names, numbers, operations, and a chilling pattern. Dozens of names crossed out with red ink. Every one of them had vanished under mysterious circumstances, many of them former agents or whistleblowers. The most recent entry? Monarch's real name. Next to it, no red line, just a question mark. Agnes insisted they get the ledger copied, secured, and sent to allies in U.S. intelligence. But the moment they exited the vault, 3 armed men were waiting. Jack barely had time to push Agnes behind a marble column before the shooting began. He neutralized 2 attackers, while Reyes handled the third with a stun blade. But the encounter made it clear. They were now fully exposed. They couldn't return to the U.S. without risking an ambush. Instead, they activated a shadow protocol Jack had hoped never to use. Operation Widowmaker, a fallback escape and counterattack plan originally designed in the event of U.S. operatives being burned by their own agency. It meant going dark, using cash reserves, anonymous identities, and safe houses across 3 countries. Agnes adapted surprisingly well to this life, blending in as a retired archaeologist while maintaining contact through burner relays. In one safe house in Trieste, she discovered a hidden compartment with documents tying Echo to an energy magnate in Dubai, one whose shell companies matched the ledger. Jack knew they had to go to the source. Posing as an elite security consultant, he infiltrated the magnate's compound. What he uncovered was even more unsettling. An encrypted live feed showing Monarch restrained inside a facility in Istanbul, guarded by mercenaries and hooked up to 4 drips. They were keeping her alive, likely to extract intelligence or use her as bait. Jack and Agnes set a date. No more evasion. No more shadows. They would strike. Reyes prepped a digital blackout, Malone and Parks returned to form an extraction squad, and Agnes insisted on going in, not just to observe but to participate. She said simply, "If I train to protect my home, I can fight to protect our people." And so she did. With Jack beside her, she parachuted into the outskirts of Istanbul under cover of night. They breached the facility during a storm that knocked out regional power. Inside it was chaos, alarms, shouts, gunfire. But Jack moved like water, clearing halls, Reyes feeding him schematics in real time, and Agnes navigating by instinct and courage. They found Monarch restrained in a locked chamber, surrounded by 4 guards. Jack dispatched 3. Agnes handled the 4th with a precision jab from her cane that punctured a nerve cluster, dropping the man instantly. Monarch was weak, but conscious. Jack carried her out while Agnes secured the route behind them, booby-trapping doors with improvised charges from a disguise kit she'd customized herself. As the team fled through the underground tunnel, the building erupted behind them in fire and confusion. Once safe, Monarch revealed the final piece. Echo wasn't just trying to build a rogue army. He was assembling a list of compromised agents to auction off to the highest bidder. The ledger was Phase 1. Phase 2? A full digital repository of identities, locations, and family members. The implications were catastrophic. Jack coordinated with NATO cybersecurity teams to intercept the auction, and within days, the entire operation collapsed in a wave of arrests, blackouts, and intelligence sweeps. Echo vanished, but not before sending one final message. This isn't over. And next time, your mother won't be there to save you. Jack saved the message, not as a threat, but as a reminder of who they were fighting. Agnes returned home with new scars, a few medals quietly awarded behind closed doors, and the respect of people who once thought she was just another sweet grandma. But Jack knew the truth. Agnes had become something more than legend. She was the spine of a resistance that refused to age, fade, or surrender. Together, they'd face the ghosts of war, the weight of betrayal, and the wrath of men who thought themselves untouchable. And they'd won, not with brute strength alone, but with courage, wit, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. In the quiet after the storm, they sat once more on the porch, sipping tea under a fading sun, both of them aware that peace was temporary but love was the constant armor. Agnes turned to Jack and said, "So what's next?" Jack grinned. "Next? We teach a workshop on how to disarm a terrorist using a handbag." They both laughed, and somewhere in the distance, the world dared to breathe a little easier, because it now knew, you don't mess with Commander Nana. Life had shifted again for Agnes and Jack, though the rhythm now had its own strange calm. Back home, Agnes had become a symbol. Local newspapers called her Commander Nana, while national security officials whispered her name in classified debriefings with a mix of awe and disbelief. She didn't seek the spotlight, but the spotlight found her. Still, she kept her feet grounded. The porch swing creaked the same way it always had. Her teacup never ran dry. Yet, something within her had evolved. No longer was she just a mother to a soldier, she was a soldier in her own right. Jack took on a quieter role too, shifting from direct engagement to training, teaching clandestine tactics to intelligence officers and elite law enforcement, always reminding them of one central lesson. Never underestimate the person you least expect. But quiet was never forever, especially in a world that remembered their names. One rainy night, a coded letter arrived tucked inside a bouquet of blue asters left at Agnes' front porch. No signature, but she knew the pattern. It was from Monarch, now living completely off-grid after her rescue, and the message was simple. "Widows are rising." Jack read the letter beside her, recognizing what it meant. Widows was the code name for a network of former agents' families targeted by rogue factions still loyal to Echo. The system may have been exposed, but splinters of it survived, reorganized in digital shadows and whispered rumors. The implication was clear. More families were in danger, and Monarch was asking them to join a counter-effort. Not an official task force, but a civilian-led ghost unit, people too invisible to be noticed, too underestimated to be stopped. Agnes didn't flinch. "Let's get to work," she said. Their new mission was different, not reactive but preventative. They began by establishing a secure communication chain for families of active and former operatives, under the guise of a bereavement support group. It was Agnes' idea to call it Home Guard. In reality, it became a grassroots intelligence gathering network, with mothers, daughters, brothers, and cousins feeding in real-time tips about suspicious activity that otherwise slipped through bureaucratic cracks. Agnes trained them with unorthodox methods, using pie recipes as encryption keys, knitting patterns as ciphered messages. Jack, always skeptical of such unconventional tactics, eventually had to admit, it worked. They intercepted 2 planned abductions and exposed a shell company funneling funds to mercenary recruiters in Madagascar. Meanwhile, Echo's shadow loomed closer. Surveillance flagged a digital trace, the name Echo embedded deep within blockchain records tied to stolen biometric data. Jack recognized it as the first breadcrumb in a new game. A digital war was brewing, one where identities could be erased, manufactured, or sold like merchandise. Jack and Agnes realized this fight would be unlike any before. Physical skill meant little in a battlefield where code was the weapon. They needed help. Enter Ava Citron Lau, a rogue coder and AI expert Jack had once rescued from a failed NSA op. She owed Jack her life, and she returned the favor by designing a decentralized firewall that acted like a digital minefield, able to identify and disable malware in real time. Agnes, though less technical, found a way to contribute. Using an old typewriter and Morse code translator, she developed a way to send analog distress signals over amateur radio frequencies that couldn't be traced or blocked. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved lives when the Widow network in Oslo went dark for 72 hours after a major blackout. Still, Echo advanced. He unveiled a ghost identity program, cloned digital fingerprints, facial recognition bypasses, even fake DNA profiles, selling them to criminals, spies, and terrorists across the world. And buried in that tech, one horrific twist: Agnes' name. Her biometric profile had been stolen and replicated into a digital phantom that had been used to access encrypted archives in Poland and Norway. Jack's blood ran cold. Echo wasn't just trying to kill them. He was trying to erase their reputations, one identity at a time. They needed proof, and that meant returning to the field. The lead pointed them to a black site in Morocco, posing as a luxury data center. Jack and Agnes infiltrated with help from Citron and a local asset named Kareem. Inside, they found rows of cold servers and a digital clone farm. Racks of AI profiles built from stolen lives. There, in the core server, was Echo's new project, Spectre. Agnes' file was listed in the top 10. Jack planted charges to destroy the facility, but not before Agnes, using a technique she learned from Monarch, slipped a microdrive into the mainframe and copied everything. The explosion took out the site and every clone file, except what they had salvaged. Back home, they decoded it. What they found was staggering. Echo had begun embedding personality profiles into digital assistants, training AI systems with the thoughts, preferences, and decision-making patterns of real people. Some alive, many long dead. His endgame wasn't just identity theft. It was immortality through stolen consciousness. He was building digital ghosts to manipulate politics, economics, and warfare under the radar. The world was being remade by the reflections of people who had never consented. Agnes stared at the screen and said, "He's not just fighting for power. He's fighting to be remembered." Jack nodded. "Then we end him before he becomes a myth." That set the course for their final mission. Echo's hub was traced to an isolated server compound in Patagonia, protected by anti-drone tech, private mercenaries, and climate conditions that made infiltration near suicidal. But Agnes had an idea. She proposed a misdirection: leak partial data from the Spectre program to draw Echo's attention elsewhere while they struck from a blind spot. The plan was risky. If Echo suspected a trap, he could activate a full memory wipe of every stolen identity. But the alternative was letting his army of digital phantoms infect global systems. They launched the operation at dawn. Citron blacked out satellite feeds for 10 minutes. Kareem created a viral news leak about an anti-identity movement. Monarch, reactivated for one final mission, led a separate strike on Echo's Berlin proxy server. Meanwhile, Jack and Agnes parachuted into the stormy hills of Patagonia. Jack had his weapon. Agnes had her cane, a signal jammer built into her coat lining, and a backup hard drive strapped to her ankle. They reached the compound under freezing rain, navigating wind-blown paths and electronic tripwires. Inside, they encountered AI defenses mimicking human behavior, machines that could smile, cry, even plead. Agnes, unfazed, disabled them with an EMP burst disguised as a blood pressure monitor. They reached the mainframe, where Echo's voice greeted them from a holographic projection. "You're too late," he said, smiling. "Your likeness has already been bought." Jack launched into combat, taking down real guards while Agnes hacked into the AI command port using the oldest trick in the book. She physically disconnected the system and input a manual override, a trick Jack had taught her during their first training session. She typed in a single line of code: delete/spectre/user/clone001, AGN3S.M. The servers began to melt down. Echo screamed, not in pain but in fury, as his digital empire crumbled around them. They escaped just before the failsafe ignited, leveling the facility. In the end, there was no glory, no medals, no headlines. But the clone program was gone. The Widow network was safe. Echo had vanished, maybe dead, maybe something else. But his shadow had been pulled into the light. Back home, Agnes hosted a simple gathering for the families they'd helped. No war stories, just food, laughter and hugs. But those present knew the truth. They weren't just guests of a kind old woman. They were witnesses to the legend of a grandmother who refused to let fear define her. Jack watched his mother from across the yard, and for the first time in years, he felt peace. He approached her as the sun dipped below the treetops, and she handed him a glass of lemonade. "So," she said, "do you think this time it's finally over?" Jack smiled. "As long as there's darkness, people like Echo will try to shape it. But thanks to you, Mom, there's more light than they can handle." Agnes chuckled. "Then we'll stay ready. Just in case someone else thinks a little old lady can't save the world." And somewhere in the quiet corners of cyberspace, a new message began to circulate. Not a threat, not a virus, but a lesson. A digital whisper that read, "Don't underestimate the old woman with a cane. She might have raised Delta Force." Life after Echo's fall didn't revert to normal, because normal had never truly existed for Agnes and Jack, but it settled into a rhythm of purposeful silence, a kind of knowing stillness reserved for those who had once held the line between chaos and order. The Widow network remained operational, not as a reactive body, but as a proactive shield. Agnes transitioned into a mentorship role, guiding new recruits, spouses, parents, and even grandchildren of former agents, teaching them everything from self-defense to encryption with a teacup in one hand and a pen in the other. The command center was disguised as a quilting club, and each patch had meaning. Colors denoting skill level, patterns embedded with coordinates, textures representing status updates. Jack resumed civilian life in a town that still whispered about the incident with Officer Johnson, though no one quite knew the whole truth. The officer had transferred quietly, his record sealed but his demeanor transformed. Humbled by the encounter, he now trained cadets on restraint and the unseen strength in the everyday citizen. Meanwhile, a documentary surfaced anonymously online titled The Ghost in the Garden, chronicling the downfall of Spectre, the AI clone project, and hinting at the role played by an unnamed matriarch. Agnes never confirmed it was about her, but the closing frame, an old woman walking into the sunset with a radio in hand, left little doubt. Schools began discussing digital ethics with more urgency, governments fast-tracked legislation to regulate biometric data, and private companies scrambled to ensure they weren't unknowingly using remnants of the Spectre framework. The world had changed, and in many ways, Agnes had nudged it toward that change. But not all shadows fade quietly. Weeks after the documentary aired, Agnes received a simple envelope with a single phrase typed in red ink. "Echoes never die." Jack analyzed the envelope. It bore no fingerprints, no traceable residue, not even a DNA signature. It was as if the message had arrived from the wind. For a brief moment, they both sat in silence, wondering whether this was a threat, a challenge, or merely a reminder. But Agnes, true to form, shrugged and tucked the note into her knitting box. "If an echo speaks and no one listens," she said, "then it's just noise." Her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was faith in what she and Jack had built, a living network of guardians. In time, Agnes began traveling, invited to speak at private security summits, university ethics boards, and clandestine gatherings of cyber defense coalitions. She never used a PowerPoint. Instead, she told stories, of gardens and ghosts, of strength hidden behind glasses and gray hair, of codes written in doilies and secrets baked into apple pie. She became a legend not through power, but through principle. And as she told those stories, the world leaned in. Jack, too, found healing. He opened a training center disguised as a woodworking shop, teaching martial arts, tactical awareness, and most importantly, self-discipline to young people who felt lost in the digital noise of the modern world. His first student, a teenage girl named Mia, was the daughter of a former operative who had been compromised by Spectre. Under Jack's guidance, she transformed into a confident, sharp-minded leader, and eventually took over the Widow Network's New York division. In her, Jack saw the future, smart, resilient, and unwilling to be underestimated. But for all the global impact, the true core of their story remained rooted in something deeply personal: family. Agnes and Jack never forgot that everything started because a mother wouldn't let injustice go unanswered, and a son believed enough in her to train her for war. Their bond, once tested by distance and secrecy, had been reforged in fire. They celebrated birthdays again, not with lavish parties but quiet dinners. Jack even taught Agnes how to play chess, and she beat him 3 games in a row before he realized she had studied military strategy texts during her downtime. "I told you," she said with a wink, "never underestimate Grandma." The final twist came quietly. One snowy evening, a knock came at Agnes' door. She opened it to find a woman in her late 40s with striking green eyes and a familiar posture. "Are you Agnes Marshall?" she asked. Agnes nodded. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Lila. My mother was in the original Echo database. I think you saved her, without even knowing." Lila explained how she had tracked down Agnes using fragments of decrypted Spectre logs and recovered files that named Agnes as the trigger agent who initiated the Spectre shutdown. She had come not to ask for help, but to offer it. "I'm a cyber forensics specialist. I want to help ensure nothing like this happens again. I want to join Home Guard." Agnes smiled and let her in, knowing that her work, her legacy, was far from over. As snow blanketed the world outside, and the fire crackled with warmth inside, Agnes looked out at the trees swaying in the wind, and thought about how many lives had been touched, how many battles had been fought without a single headline. She thought of Officer Johnson, who now lectured at police academies about the day a grandmother taught him humility. She thought of Echo, wherever he might be, dead, digital, or dormant. And most of all she thought of Jack, her boy who had turned her into a warrior, who had believed in her when the world saw only wrinkles. That night, she wrote in her journal, the one she started the day Jack left for basic training. Her final entry read, "I was never meant to be the hero. But when the world needed me, I stood. I didn't stand alone. And I never will again." The next morning, she woke up to sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Jack was already in the kitchen, making pancakes. "What's the plan today?" he asked. Agnes grinned. "Same as always. We stay ready." And so the story ended not with gunfire or headlines, but with quiet resilience, whispered legacies, and the unshakable truth that heroes come in all forms. Some wear capes. Some carry rifles. And some just carry a teacup and a secret past that changed the world.